Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This webinar is addressing disproportionality, opportunities, and risks. And we know people will continue to join in, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. We want to make sure that you have time for all of the material that we're going to be providing you. My name is Connie Silva, and I'm the director of the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. We are funded by the California Department of Education to provide supports and resources to local educational agencies here in California that are addressing disproportionality and significant disproportionality, and we welcome you to this session. We are actually housed at the Napa County Office of Education, so our team members that you see are here at Napa County. We're paid for out of, as I said, a contract with CBE. So as you pop in, we'd really like to see who's online with us. This is a meeting format, so we are going to be using chat quite a bit. If you want to go ahead and chat and put your name and your LEA or your SELPA, the organization that you're with, in chat, that would be great. So we can all know who's in the room with us. And again, welcome. We are recording this session, so one of the things we want to make sure is that people have access to the information. There's sometimes a lot of information and it can be overwhelming, so you will be provided with a recording after the session, so you have access to it to review at a later time. And also, if you wanted to share it with anyone, a colleague who wasn't able to join us today, you can feel free to do that. And I can see everybody popping up in chat. Thank you so much for sharing your information. Also, for your information, we do have closed captioning. So if you need that, please go ahead and click on the icon at the bottom of your Zoom doc. And then that way you'll be able to get closed captioning on your screen as well. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get started. We are going to be, during this meeting, it's a meeting format, so you are actually muted right now, but you are able to unmute if you wanted to ask a question at any time, and we're going to ask you to ask questions as we go. You can use chat though, so definitely feel, if you're more comfortable, put your questions in chat and we will go to those from time to time and make sure that we answer what you're asking about. Also, you may have other just items to add in chat, not necessarily a question, so feel free to do that as we go along. And then we do have a couple polls, so there are a couple times during this session where we'll ask you to participate in a Zoom poll, okay? So what we're going to cover today, we are obviously going to be talking about disproportionality and significant disproportionality. So we'll make sure that you have the definition here in California. And then we're going to talk about the importance of addressing disproportionality in a preventative or proactive manner. And you're going to hear specifically from someone who's done that, another LEA. And then we also are going to make sure you know about additional resources that are available for you. So we'll let you know where to find those resources so that you can begin addressing disproportionality within your SIN plan, okay? So my first question, this is just for chat. If you can go ahead and put in chat the indicator for which your LEA is disproportionate, if you happen to know that. This is not a test, so don't feel bad if you're not quite sure. But if you could share with us the area of disproportionality. As I'm seeing a couple of them pop up in discipline. Okay. Yeah. We do have, thank you, I see some that have more than one area. That's not uncommon. Many of our districts that are disproportionate have more than one area of disproportionality. And in fact, for those that are significantly disproportionate, we do also have some districts that, again, because they have multiple years of disproportionality, end up being significantly disproportionate for more than one indicator. Okay, great. Well, let's continue. Again, thank you for sharing that. So I do want to go over the definitions, again, making sure everyone in the room is familiar with what it means when you're identified for disproportionality. So disproportionality is written into the Individuals with Disabilities Act. So the reason that a district is disproportionate is because a particular race or ethnic group of students in the LEA is more likely to be experiencing one of three different things. So they may be disciplined, and you saw some of those people in chat mention that discipline is an area of identification. So students of a particular race or ethnicity may be disciplined more than all other students in that particular LEA. They also may be identified as a student with a disability, or even identified with a particular disability, right? So that's the difference between 9 and 10 indicators. And then the last area is this group of students may be provided their education outside of the general education environment more than their peers, at a higher level than their peers. So again, when we're looking at this based on race and ethnicity, that group of students is compared to students of all other races. And what we call that, the more likely to be identified or disciplined or in a different, educated in a different environment, we use risk ratios. So the use of risk ratio or an alternate risk ratio is mandated by IDEA, and I can talk a little bit about what happens within California. So the risk ratio that California uses it, so at what point is a district identified as having disproportionality? And the threshold within California is a 3.0 risk ratio. And what that means is, as I just said, like a certain group of students, and I'll give an example. If you were identified for African American students in discipline, it would mean that a student that is African American is at least 3 times as likely to be disciplined compared to all other students in that LEA, right? So just based on race and ethnicity and no other factors, that student is 3 times as likely to experience that. Again, if it were an identification, it would be identified. So there is a recording that we have done with CDE that explains, how they get the student count and so on, and the actual calculation of a risk ratio. It's pretty simple mathematics, but again, it's a really simple and relatively quick recording. So we want to make sure that you have that recording available. There's also a document that accompanies that says everything sort of narratively that's explained in the video. So if you want to hear more about that, that can be a helpful resource for you. And we just put that information in chat as well. So why do we focus on disproportionality? So there's a few things to think about. Obviously, it's a concern if students are experiencing something differently than their peers just based on race or ethnicity. But disproportionality in special education, we really want to emphasize that it has an impact on what happens with the student, not just in terms of what happens in special education, but in general education. So from research, we know the data and how students are impacted. And there's multiple areas in general education, such as those that you see popping up on the screen: graduation rates, achievement, attendance, discipline, and even the outcomes for English learners. All of those are impacted when identification is happening that's inappropriate, or when discipline is happening at higher levels, and also when students aren't educated to the extent possible in the general education environment, right? And then, of course, there's always, the moral imperative. We know that it's wrong that students are having different experiences simply based on the fact that they are a particular race or ethnicity within that LEA. So the laws within IDEA really stem from civil rights. So this is all about, correcting something that we know is unfair and inequitable, and that we do need to address, not just for the students that are experiencing this experience, but for all students. Because when we improve systems so that there's more equitable and appropriate identifications, disciplines, and placements, all students within the LEAs benefit. And of course, we know, as this last bullet said, students with disabilities are general education students first. So we do need to make sure that our systems, including those within the general education environment, are appropriately serving all of our students. And then we have this little quote from one of our colleagues out there from Paramount Unified School District, Dr. Topikia Jones, who said, "We have to do the work for the few to benefit the many," right? This is what's actually going to support all of our students if we do this work in a way that addresses the disproportionality. So the other thing we want to point out is, we mentioned earlier, significant disproportionality. So how is significant disproportionality different from disproportionality? In California, and this is a state identified methodology, a district is considered significantly disproportionate once they have been identified as disproportionate for 3 years in a row in the exact same indicator for the same group of students. So I can just briefly demonstrate what that would look like. So let's just say this is one LEA and they happen to be out in the year 21-22. Their data shows that they are disproportionate for both Hispanic students in SLD. You can see their risk ratio is 4.45, and for African American students for other health impairment, right? They have a 3.2 indicator risk ratio. So in the following year, their Hispanic students and their African American students both continue to be disproportionate with risk ratios higher than 3.0, the 22-23. Then in the third year, their Hispanic students, again, the risk ratio is even higher, again above 3, so it's at 4.52. However, their African American identification of African American students as OHI fell below the 3.0 threshold, right? It's now 2.8. So in this particular circumstance, this district would be identified for significant disproportionality in 25 for Hispanic SLD. However, they would not be identified for significant disproportionality for their African American students for being over-identified for OHI. This is a really important example to show, because what can sometimes happen is this district will now have things they have to do in order to address their significant disproportionality for their Hispanic students or their Latino students for SLD. However, you can see that there is still a problem, I would say, with their data and the experiences for their African American students with OHI. So that's part of the reason when a district is identified as significantly disproportionate, we ask them to look at all of their data, because we want them to really be aware of which students and which areas are problematic, even if it hasn't risen to the threshold of identification of significant disproportionality. So what you're going to be hearing about today are some of the preventative work that can be done to address things before they fall to this level. Part of the reason it's important is I'm going to just share briefly what happens within significant disproportionality. When a district is identified as significantly disproportionate, they're actually required to do a SIM plan, which I know is not all that different from what other districts are doing, whether they're in targeted or intensive, but it has unique requirements for significant disproportionality that are based on IDA regulations. One of them is that 15% of their IDA allocation needs to be moved into a general education fund now, and they are required to provide comprehensive coordinated early intervening services. And what that means, in order to know what services to provide, they actually need to address policies, practices, and procedures that contribute to the disproportionality. So there's a root cause analysis process that happens, and it's really looking at what systemic issues are getting in the way, creating barriers or challenges, or sort of pushing students into a certain category, right? And again, once they identify those things, then they provide comprehensive coordinated early intervening services with that 15% set aside that is now removed from special education funds and actually devoted to addressing the significant disproportionality. Okay, so just pausing for a moment. And again, feel free to put any questions that you have in chat. I'm not seeing any right now. So what we're talking about today and what you're going to hear about in the rest of this webinar are those opportunities. So as a disproportionate LEA, you have opportunities to proactively address your disproportionality and prevent significant disproportionality. I'm going to pass it on to Susan Stewart, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about that and move us into the next part of the session. Thanks.
Thank you, Connie. Yeah, so we are providing you some information about how you can address your disproportionality in a little bit deeper way than just the CDE requirements. So the reason, again, that we want to do this is that some of you may be able to avoid becoming significantly disproportionate, which includes that 15% set aside of your IDEA allocation. Those of you who are maybe in year 2 of your disproportionality, you are likely not 100% certain to be in SIGDIS next year. And so there's things that you can do to get a head start on that. But before we talk some specific details about strategies you can employ, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the role of the superintendent. And we'll have a chance to hear from Dr. Adam Clark, who is the superintendent of Mount Diablo Unified School District. We have found that the role of the superintendent is really important to this work because it makes a significant impact both on the quality of the planning as well as the effectiveness of the implementation of plans to address disproportionality. And while involving the superintendent may not automatically come to mind when you're addressing other compliance concerns, it really is valuable when you're looking at disproportionality. So let's hear from Dr. Adam Clark.
As superintendents, we have so much on our plate, and there's a thinking of this is someone else's responsibility, or there's another team that's going to do this, or this is the special education department or student services or the curriculum department. But as superintendent, how I've really embraced this is making sure that I am an active, not only leader in the process, but I'm an active participant. I'm a listener. I have to be at the table as we're having the discussions around what our data is telling us, shifts in our systems we need to make. And oftentimes there is miscommunications that could take place if I'm not right there at the table, being able to hear firsthand what's working and what's not, and then also being able to really communicate my expectations, the goals of the board, and really just my position power to make sure that things start happening in a positive way to address the true needs of our students. And so as a superintendent, I think it's vital that we take an active role throughout this process so that we can learn things about our system that we may not know. We can also help get things moving that may be delayed if we're not part of the discussion. And just to show everyone within the organization that this work is important to us and that we value each and every one of our students and that we're getting extra close to that foundational work and improving outcomes for all students, not just our students that have been identified as significantly disproportionate.
We're very fortunate to have Dr. Clark, who has had such an aha around this work, share his experience with us and actually with others. We heard just last week from an LEA down in El Monte who had just listened to him and really gotten some fire about this work. So hopefully, if you want to share this video with your superintendent, let us know and we can send it to them. And also, it looks like Connie answered Lisa's question in chat. So thank you very much, Connie and Lisa. And I have the good pleasure of welcoming and introducing you to Dr. Tasha Woods. She is a school psychologist with San Diego Unified School District. And she has led the work to address disproportionality in San Diego Unified for many years. And interestingly enough, San Diego was originally identified as significantly disproportionate, but shortly afterward, they were identified as only disproportionate. But as a group, they decided that although they weren't required to address disproportionality, since they weren't significantly disproportionate, they decided to continue to do that work. And so, Dr. Tasha Woods, would you like to provide more context to that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Stewart and Mrs. Silva for inviting me and allowing us to share our disproportionality journey, as we call it, in San Diego Unified School District. So as Dr. Stewart had stated, we were initially found significantly disproportionate in the category of emotional disturbance for African American students receiving IEP services. That was way back during the 2012-13 school year. But the data year was 2010-11. And so the next couple of months, the California Department of Education had revised some of the data year information. And so a few months after being considered significantly disproportionate, we were no longer significantly disproportionate and identified still in that same area as disproportionate. But we did not want to abandon the work. So we continued with our efforts as we had several audits that rendered reports on some of our practices in special ed throughout the district. So we were fortunate that we had already pretty much got started on the mitigating some of these disparities. And so when we were still required at the time to do, I think it was a self-assessment and a state audit, we continued that work.
Thank you, Dr. Woods. And I just want to let folks know that we're going to hear from Dr. Tasha Woods several times throughout our time together as we talk about strategies you might want to employ and then how San Diego Unified actually utilize those strategies to address their disproportionality. But first, I want to give you an idea of where you're going to find those resources that you might want to consider adding to your planning around disproportionality. Now, we have on the screen the caltan.info website, and the link is in chat. We will also be putting up a folder. There's one on Google Drive and one in Dropbox. They're the same content, but some people have difficulties with one or the other of those. So you will be able to access all of the activity handouts that we'll be describing to you. But in case you want to look for them on Caltan, maybe you lose our folder or just want to explore it yourself, you're going to go to the caltan.info website. You're going to select the monitoring tab. And then underneath that, you are going to select the significant disproportionality tab at the bottom of the screen. And that is where you will find all of the materials. So obviously the materials for step 1 will be under that tab, and step 2 under step 2, and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to have on the left side of this slide all of the things that CDE is requiring that disproportionate LEAs do to address their disproportionality. And then on the right side, we're going to provide some considerations. Remember, this is all optional, the things that we're talking about today. These are just some tools that you might want to consider, especially if you feel like you can do something to address disproportionality so you don't become significantly disproportionate, or in the other case, if you are likely to become significantly disproportionate in the next year, you can get a head start on some of these things. So we'll be talking about 4 things under step 1, and these are things that significantly disproportionate LEAs do as part of their SIM process. So the 4 we're going to talk about under step 1 are the reviewing policies, practices, and procedures, doing a programmatic self-assessment, completing the student case study, and developing an educational partners group. So let's look at that first one. So as Connie mentioned, IDEA directs significantly disproportionate LEAs to review their policies, practices, and procedures. And so we have a process that is designed specifically around disproportionality to address policies, practices, and procedures. And please note, this is not a typical policies and procedures review for compliance. It's really looking at what is getting in the way of equitable education for students based on race and ethnicity within the system. So we're looking at how is the system working. So I have highlighted an area under instruction number 1 where it says gather, and there are 2 resources there that I want to point you to. The first is the Policy, Practices, and Procedures Review Matrix that was developed by 2 of the SPP-TAP TA facilitator, Dr. Mildred Brown, with support from Steve Collins. And also they have created for us a sample so that if you utilize this table, you'll be able to not only examine your policies, practices, and procedures, you can look at the sample to see just how much information you're going to need to incorporate into the review to make this a helpful process for you. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to let Dr. Tasha Woods talk about the ways in which the policies, practices, and procedures review was an informative data process, gathering process, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what she learned about their systems as a result.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. While we were in the disproportionality phase, recently removed from that significant disproportionality for the category of ED, we had participated, as I mentioned, in a lot of 2, I think, audits, and those reports helped us focus our work and rendered some recommendations for our current policies and our practices. So we were able to develop and research first the what other districts were doing, and LA Unified had a emotional disturbance comprehensive evaluation process. And so we were able to look at that work, look how some of that work may fit into our district. And so that was one of the practices and policies that changed, because we were able to have a board approved document for comprehensive evaluation processes for both our multilingual learners and our students that were categorized or were in that realm, as we were looking to see if they would qualify as emotional disturbance. So that's one place that our policies and procedures prior to or after, both, I guess, prior to becoming significantly disproportionate in ED, and then after subsequently becoming disproportionate. Here's where things did get a little more concerning. We had, in subsequent years, started to see more of that pattern for discipline. And so we were then disproportionate for African Americans in the area of discipline, specifically over 10 days of out of school suspensions. So we had continued to work on our to mitigate for these other disparities. So we then were able to shift and continue the work during this time. We looked at our uniform discipline plan policy. We knew that we were beginning to work on our restorative discipline policy. And so that's where we did see a lot of those shifts as we transitioned from UDP to the RDP was our acronyms there. We did conduct focus groups and empathy interviews as well. And we had a lot of collaboration with, during that time, I think there was a shift in calling it an oversight committee to the term I really love, educational partners. So we were able to utilize some of the work that we had been doing with decreasing the number of students that received support, African-American students that received support under emotional disturbance. And then we did definitely shift that to looking at the overrepresentation of our African-American students with IEPs in the area of discipline.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like this process not only worked in the area of disproportionality that you had been identified for, but that it opened up some areas, other areas that were of concern that just kind of popped up in that review process. Great, thank you. All right. So our next activity handout is around the data drill down, and you're probably familiar with the data drill down that is part of the SIM process. And it's similar in that in significant disproportionality, there are some things, some tools that you use that are used in the other SIM process. However, the data drill down that we'll be talking about is a little more comprehensive, and there really is a focus on the culture, using a cultural lens to ensure that you're considering race and ethnicity in all the work that you're doing around data. And we, in our data drill down, really emphasize both quantitative as well as qualitative data. because that really ensures that we have a greater understanding of the data. And I think Dr. Woods talked about both empathy interviews and focus groups that really brought to life their understanding around the practices that were occurring, that were creating some challenges for their students. So I'm not suggesting that you do the full data drill down for significant disproportionality, but there's some of the things that are part of the data drill down for significant disproportionality that could be useful as you focus in your STEM, which include disaggregating the data by race and ethnicity. You might also want to explore your local educational data related to your area of disproportionality and really incorporate the general education data. Connie mentioned that this is important because our students are coming from general education before they get to special education. And so we need to see what else might be happening. Also, you want to look at the historical data for risk ratios. You can use the SILS IDC tool, and you can disaggregate that information by race and ethnicity so that you can get those risk ratios and you can look at them over time. And that allows you then to see some trends or other areas of concern that you might want to consider as you address the disproportionality that you've been for. I'm going to stop before I go any further into this because I understand that there's a question from a participant about what is RDP and UDP. So Dr. Woods, can you speak to that?
Yes, so the Uniform Discipline Policy was our UDP, and then the Restorative Discipline Policy is our RDP.
Great, thank you. If you're really eager to get down to the root of the problem around disproportionality, you might want to consider a complete programmatic self-assessment process. These were designed specifically to highlight concerns around disproportionality. There are 3 tools that CDE has recommended, and all of them rely on quantitative data, and 2 of them have a process that also looks at qualitative data. And it really, both of these, or all of these, really provide an opportunity to evaluate the LEA system to better understand the causes of disproportionality. And I do need to tell you that a programmatic self-assessment requires a bit of time, and it's best supported by a knowledgeable technical assistance facilitator. So if your LEA chooses to go this route, we can help you identify a technical assistance facilitator to support you in the process. The reason you might want to do this is if you want to get ahead of the game, maybe you're anticipating being significantly disproportionate, or you just want to dig down deeper to understand more about what might be going on. Dr. Woods, I understand that you completed one of the programmatic self-assessments when you were voluntarily addressing disproportionality. Can you speak to that?
Yes, I can. So again, you all may recall, I mentioned we were significantly deemed significantly disproportionate in a matter of months, no longer just significantly disproportionate. So again, not wanting to abandon that work, we continued on the activities that were planned. They were altered, a little bit, but we did take a look at the annotated checklist, which we had received some guidance from SPP-TAP on that Wisconsin annotated checklist, looking at some of the racial disparities. Some of the things that we noticed as we were working with some school sites is that looking at our current language of tiered support, we noticed that many of the sites in their responses were looking for support at higher level tier 2 or tier 3, meaning going up that more intensive area. And we felt like there was, what we noticed is there was a lack of wanting to look at universal supports and access. And so we were able to spend time in just sharing with those school sites our observations and hearing, why the whys and why nots of why they considered going to higher tiers and not looking more into preventative supports and measures. So they had an opportunity to select different strategies. And so again, those strategies were more aligned with higher levels of support. We also noticed that many of these sites felt that they already had a handle on some of the practices, and we were able to really have open conversations and to try and veer away from confirmation bias, so to speak, and to be able to align our qualitative data with the quantitative data, because we felt like quantitatively, folks looking at that data, what the data represents, they were able to digest that and process that, but then making the connection then of what prompted these outcomes, there is where we did tend to see a little bit of cognitive dissonance.
Thank you, Dr. Woods. I think the thing that jumped out at me that you said is that the tool provided a structure for having those conversations that might have, if they didn't have the tool, might have led you down different paths that may have not addressed your disproportionality, but were things that people thought might be the answer, but in the end were not. So I can see how that would have been a very helpful process for you. We're going to have Connie talk a little bit more about the value of qualitative data and why you want to might want to include that in your work as addressing the disproportionality that you're experiencing.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Yeah, we want to take a moment to, we know that, again, when districts are identified, whether it's disproportionality or significant disproportionality, it's quantitative data that creates identification, and often we stay in that realm as we're looking at data and deciding what to do next. And quantitative data is very important. As you can see from this slide, it can show you that something is wrong, right? That's what leads to identification. It can also point you in a general direction of where to focus your improvement efforts, right? When you're looking at just the quantitative data. But one thing it cannot do, it cannot help you understand what's wrong or why it's wrong or how to fix it, right? So that's how, as Tasha was describing earlier, you end up with lots of theories. Well, we think this, we believe that. Here's what we've known from other reasons, but those are our theories. And the way to really get at what might be the right direction is qualitative data. So one book that we've been using quite a lot, and I know it's been used also by the California Collaborative for Excellence in Education, is called Street Data. So street data, it reminds us what is measurable, what is measurable is not the same as what is valuable, right? So it really opens up our eyes to gathering qualitative data, particularly data that is actually from the voice of our students or our families that are not having the same experiences, successful experiences as other students in our LEAs. So I just want to, again, say a little bit more about this and the whole concept of street data. Again, you can see that the authors of this, it's actually a book put out by Corwin Press, Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan. They're actually California educators and advocates. And this is sort of the next generation model for equity, pedagogy, and school transformation. What it does is it defines data on different levels. So whether quantitative or qualitative, it talks about the satellite data, which is sort of that bigger picture that we typically see when we're looking at what's happening around the nation, what's happening in California, and so on. And then you get to map data, which helps us identify gaps more specifically. So perhaps in teacher or instructional gaps, it can lead us in a slightly more focused direction. What they really focus on in this book and what we try to get districts to focus on is street data. And street data is that data that really helps us understand, again, the experience of the students, of the parents, also of staff, right, of users of our system, right? So if we understand their experience, then we can get more specific ideas around misconceptions and mindsets that are impacting the outcomes within our LEAs. And it helps us monitor this internalization of important skills, right? It requires us to have real focused listening skills and observations, and being open to vulnerability. Natasha got at some of the well, we didn't really see, or there was some dissonance now around what we were hearing and what we were seeing, right? That can happen. But it really does inform and shape our next moves when we're using street data. And I'm going to just illustrate that with a specific example. And again, this is a real example. So when you're using quantitative data to identify where to dig deeper, students in this particular situation, students who are foster youth were experiencing chronic absenteeism, right? That's the quantitative data that the LEA had access to. They know, in fact, that those who are foster students have more chronic absenteeism than their other students within this LEA. So as they sort of the team explored, well, what do we think is leading to this? What can we do about this? They concluded that foster youth have more difficult time getting to school on time, right? That's what they decided. That's the reason for this. That's, again, without using qualitative data, just looking at the quantitative data. So their solution was that they needed more bus routes. They needed to make it easier for students to get to school on time, right? Well, when they actually didn't make a difference, so they looked at some qualitative data. What are we going to do now? So they spoke with students and families. And what they discovered is that students weren't coming to school. They were having more absenteeism because they didn't feel welcome or valued at school. That was their reason for having chronic absenteeism. So in that case, it led to a total different solution, which was that they really needed to spend more time on things like teacher greetings, doing activities that really welcomed the students and showed them that they felt more valued at school, right? So totally different solution in both that situation, because one only looked at the quantitative data and then used our own sort of thoughts to come up with a solution. The other one looked at the qualitative data and used the voice of the students and the families to come up with a solution, right? So I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to that just for a moment, because I think, again, since we have Dr. Tasha Woods here, really like to hear something about your own experience when you did gather qualitative data, and, was that valuable, or did it help you in, again, coming up with solutions that worked?
Yes. So we found it extremely valuable. The self-assessments, we were able to, it felt as if we could, as you had stated, Connie, dig deeper than just what that quantitative data had shown. And the focus groups, and in later years, when we became significantly disproportionate, the empathy interviews had such meaningful responses and data come out. So I'll give an example. When we had a focus group with our students who had experienced discipline throughout their educational journey, they were able to give such insight that just looking at our quantitative data that represented a pattern, the pattern that we see nationwide of African American students experiencing disciplinary actions at a higher rate than other student groups. Well, seeing that, reading that is one thing, but hearing from students and what they really felt they went through from elementary, middle school, and many of these students were already in high school. It really informed what our next steps were in the process. Likewise with parents and community. But I wanted to focus on students because I feel like that, of course, that's why we're here. I feel like often we're not really placing as much emphasis on those thoughts and ideas from the students. And so that was something that was really missing. And we know now that we don't want to ever leave that piece out of seeking that information from our students, as well as, again, the broader community.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for adding that. Yeah, it's amazing. I don't think there's a single district we've worked with, but when they add qualitative data, particularly from those students' parents or even the teachers that are working with those students, that it doesn't make a difference in what they think, what they learn. I'm asking, I have, you see on the slide, I want to ask a poll. We know that gathering qualitative data is often done in other areas, right? Like for an LCAP or some other improvement area. So I do want to ask folks right now, and you can just put this in chat, or I'm sorry, there's a poll. This is a Zoom poll one. So there's just the three possible answers: yes, no, or I don't know, to whether or not you have in your LEA gathered qualitative data, again, for some kind of improvement activity within your LEA. We'll give folks a moment to answer that poll, and then we'll share it back with everyone.
Give it another minute. Looks like some folks are still responding.
Okay, no problem. I do want to say, while people are thinking about this, one of the important things, as we're talking specifically at disproportionality, sometimes we see LEAs, particularly for like their LCAP, they might have some kind of survey, some way in which they're gathering, again, what's considered more qualitative data than quantitative data. And the point that we really want to emphasize when you're working on disproportionality that's based on race and ethnicity is any kind of qualitative data that you're gathering, you really do want to focus on who is it that you're wanting to hear from. So for instance, if you have some kind of climate survey that you're doing with your students, and so you do get student voice, but you get it in an aggregate form and you don't actually know the difference between the student groups that are responding based on race and ethnicity, you won't be able to use it in the way that Tasha was just describing, right? You'll hear back what students think about something, what their experiences are in an aggregate, and you won't know, is that experience any different for your students that are African American versus Latino versus white, and so on. And so it is important, if you have some way in which you do this currently, to also take a look, is it giving you disaggregated information by race and ethnicity?
I'm going to go ahead and share the results.
Okay, thank you, Kian. Okay, so we can see a good percentage, almost 80%, 78% are using some kind of qualitative data gathering. So that's great. So so you have some way of doing that in most of your LEAs, and then just a small percent are saying no, and then some that don't know, right? So again, it's great if you're doing that already, and if you're familiar with that, and I would say take it to the next step and really check to see whether or not what you're gathering is hearing and collecting the voice from those that you really need to hear from, all right? And so that you can recognize if there are differences or not. Okay, so I'm going to pass it right back to Susan now.
Thank you. So we've been talking about qualitative data, and one of the things that we have found to be particularly illuminating when looking at disproportionality is something we're calling a student case study. So you're familiar with student record reviews that are required to do, and you're required to do a student record review for disproportionality. But the student case study that we talk about in significant disproportionality is different. In this situation, the case is actually the system, and this allows LEAs to examine the student's journey through the system on their way from general education into special education and identify where in the system there may be gaps, where there may be different experiences than other students experience, where there might be blocks, and so on. So it provides that ability to uncover some of those inconsistencies or breakdowns in the system of the referral of students for special education. And most importantly, how it differs for different racial and ethnic groups. One awareness that has really arisen from doing the case study is that while there is a policy and procedure for the referral process, it may be that each school site does the process differently. Sometimes they bypass the procedure altogether. And that is illuminated when you look at the files and you've looked at files across the LEA, not just from one site, but across the LEA, those kinds of things will be surfaced. Another example that has risen for us was that in one LEA, more African American students were being referred by teachers for other health impairments as compared to their peers. So that was something that LEA wanted to explore in a little more detail and try to understand what was happening around that. And a third example of something that came out of a case study was that Hispanic 4-year-olds were being identified for intellectual disabilities. And with a little bit further digging, they discovered that these students were being assessed in Spanish because they were from Mexico, but that their home language was Mixteca. So the case study process that is done to address disproportionality when by significantly disproportionate LEAs can be a really deeply informative process. And the process, at first, sometimes school psychs may get a little nervous, like, oh, they're going to critique what I've done. But because you're looking at systemic issues, you can bring down those barriers or that sense of resistance. And there's a sense of being able to, let's look at this together and see what we can do as a group to change what's going on for our students. Let me think. I know that Tasha did not do a student case study, so we're going to skip hearing from her this time. But we are going to move on to the Educational Partners Group. And Tasha mentioned this briefly, and we'll have her talk about it in more detail in just a moment. But Educational Partners Group is a group that you gather, and it should include family members and community members of the students who are being disproportionately identified. And they have lived experience that can really highlight the concerns and come alongside of staff to have a better understanding of what the data actually mean. It gives another angle to the perspectives. And so if you, as a disproportionate LEA, choose to, you could gather a group of educational partners. This can be, your superintendent, your director of curriculum, grade level teachers, community representatives, site administrators, a variety of people that can bring a different lens to all of this concern around the disproportionality. And they can look at the data together. And so their whole purpose is to come look at the data together to really understand what's going on underneath those quantitative data and even the qualitative data. So I know, Dr. Wood, you spoke about the importance of the student voice as being part of your qualitative data gathering. But you also talked a little bit about parents and staff and getting their input. Can you talk a little bit more about the Educational Partners Group and how that was supportive in your work?
Yes. So I did previously mention years back, we had similar to educational partners, that title of oversight committee that made up, I think, pretty much all the same folks that we see in now educational partners groups. I want to speak from the significant disproportionality lens for a second as I'm talking about the educational partners group, because we both times being significantly disproportionate was for African American students. And so the educational partners groups gave us an opportunity to be able to hear from families of African American students, but also to be transparent and acknowledge that this has been an ongoing area that the district needs to strengthen. And so those were, needless to say, incredibly intense meetings. So I don't want to shy away from being able to say, well, there is a lot of things that were extremely intense throughout these processes, but wanting to make sure that parents had an opportunity and community had an opportunity, not only just to be heard, but then to share their insights. One thing that came out of the educational partners meetings were the fact that um, many times parents felt like they were told maybe how to raise their children. So if there was flyers or information for parenting classes, instead of having some co-facilitation, instead of being able to have parents as partners. And so that was something that was definitely a benefit. And again, that transparency and acknowledging that our data, reveals these practices that are impacting this population of students. So you can't go into that with like blinders on and just trying to give a list of all the things that your district, your LEA has been doing, right? Some things have worked while others have remained stagnant. So allowing for those very challenging moments and times to be able to embrace them so that there could be further improvement and growth was definitely something that I believe having those educational partners groups benefit.
I think that's really valuable to acknowledge that it could have been, and probably was in your case, Dr. Woods, uncomfortable at times to hear from parents because you're specifically asking them to provide information about what's not working in the system. But if you are willing to be open to it, you can really learn a lot that can be very helpful and make an important and significant change. So thank you for that. I'm going to stop for a moment. I don't see any questions in chat, but I do want to just take a moment to allow people to take a breath and also provide any questions that you might have, or maybe you have an experience you'd like to share. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to write a question in or open up your mic to share. Okay. Well, feel free to go ahead and put questions or comments in chat. We do respond to those. So if anything pops up, just let us know and we will address those questions. So now we're looking at required activities in step 2 and also things that you might want to consider. So the required activities that CDE is requiring of those who are disproportionate is a prioritization of problem statements, and at least one of those must relate to disproportionality. The other activity in step 2 for dispro LEAs is a root cause analysis, and at least one root cause must address disproportionality. So those are the things that you have to do. And we're going to give you some considerations of things that you might want to do. The first is phrasing the disproportionality problem statement as a success gap statement. And I'll explain what that is in just a minute. The other is completing the initiative crosswalk, which you did for your SIM, using the significant disproportionality handout. And I'll explain why it's a little bit different. And then using culturally responsive root cause analysis tools housed on this SIGDIS Step 2 tab on the caltan.info page. And then maybe looking at identifying students who will be impacted by the work through something called identifying your target population. So the first thing that you might want to do is create a success gap statements, which is really the process of describing the group of children who are experiencing those disparities or the success gap, and the outcome area where the success gap is occurring, as well as the data about the success gap. So here's an example of a success gap. Tubman Elementary is suspending Black students in school at 3 times the rate of children of other races and ethnicities. Okay, so that you can see that the way that the success gap is written, it's identifying what the LEA is doing that is resulting in what students are experiencing as compared to their peers. I know, Tasha, that you created a success gap statement to describe your situation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, we actually had, I think, 2 or 3. One that I feel can illustrate similarly to your example is African American and Hispanic students continue to experience higher rates of suspensions and expulsions when compared to all other student groups as documented over time. And including Hispanic students was a part of that quantitative data that we were gathering at the time. And so what this helped us do is inform the root causes that I know we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Great. I'll just move right on to the root causes then. Actually, I'm going to talk about the initiative inventory and then I'll talk about the root causes. So I mentioned that the initiative inventory that is completed, the process that's completed in significant disproportionality is based upon the initiative crosswalk that all SIM LEAs are completing. What's different is on our activity handout in instruction number 3 is a set of questions, or prompts is probably a better word. And really what the focus is making sure that not only are you looking at where there are integration of initiatives, but where there are gaps in, even if you have initiatives that are meeting the needs of students, are you identifying which students may not be served or served as well by these initiatives? So it takes it a little bit deeper, particularly looking at race and ethnicity, but it doesn't have to be just race and ethnicity. It can also be other areas where, foster youth, homeless youth, and so on. For disproportionality, we are looking at specifically race and ethnicity, but these other areas are also important to consider because oftentimes we find that there are some intersections between those student groups. And then it can help you identify the areas that are higher priority than others. And that could then lead you into some activities that you want to consider for your action plan, your SIM plan. Dr. Woods, you mentioned earlier that you approached the work by leveraging the resources and funding that you already currently had. What did your team learn from the initiative inventory and how did that change what you did?
The initiative inventory really helped to, for us, focus and align the work that we saw going on through LCAP, through some of our different department initiatives, and even what some school sites were working on, some of the social emotional or mental health initiatives. For us with discipline, one of the main, as I mentioned earlier, moving from zero tolerance from that was prevalent in our uniform discipline policy to the construction of the restorative discipline policy was extremely beneficial. There had been a lot of work already around how our district was going to bring in restorative practices that led to an actual department being developed within the district, as small as that is for a huge district, but bringing in one of the things that I had mentioned, we did have some other success gaps. One was our tiered support through MTSS. So really trying to be able to identify resource mapping, but really through this inventory, we're really like looking at all of the current things that we have, implementing, that are currently being implemented, things that are proposed to be implemented, and where we can align that work and maybe shift for practices that weren't really being implemented with fidelity. So that it was very time. There was a lot of time that we spent around that, but it was because we were being extremely intentional in looking at those initiative inventory.
So that you could have a more robust system and that the different work across the different departments or sites was aligned rather than sporadic, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Quite a bit of different departments, behavior support resources, quite a bit, and wanting to make sure that we were not only communicating, but that our efforts didn't seem like it was duplicating, but instead enhancing some of the work. We had new departments coming in and youth advocacy. So we had a lot that was already within the LCAP, but again, we also wanted to ensure that we spoke to folks so that we could see where they were in implementation for many of those initiatives.
Great. All right. I promised you I'd tell you about the root cause analysis. And one of the things that you can do to enhance all of your work with intentionality is bringing the cultural lens into the work. I mentioned it around the data process, but I also want to emphasize that the root cause analysis using a cultural lens will make sure that you're purposeful about attending to race and ethnicity as you're making decisions about what root causes are contributing to your disproportionality and how you want to prioritize certain root causes to address your problem. So you'll notice on the screen that we have two very familiar tools, the fishbone and the 5 whys. So I expect that you're familiar with these. What's different about the root cause analysis with the cultural lens, these are 2 documents that are part of the activity handout for root cause analysis in significant disproportionality, is that prior to completing the root cause analysis, there's information about how to do that process with a cultural lens. And there's even some questions to help you check, did we really look at this process or engage in this process with a cultural lens so that you can learn, you can reflect on and learn about what you did and what you could do to improve in the future. And so did you, Tasha, did you involve the educational partners in the root cause analysis process?
Absolutely, we did. Yes, as well as the leadership, our administration, and our educators as well. In relation to the parents and community, one of the root causes was lack of authentic engagement with African American parents and families, resulting in distrust and a breakdown in communication. The parents definitely, there was some back and forth, a lot of back and forth with what they felt. Yes, that was a statement that definitely could be a root cause. There was again the back and forth of folks wanting a little bit more. We wanted to make sure we were having all of the input, in from our leadership. That involved our superintendent, our area superintendents, our school principals, and like I said, some of our educators. We even involved related services, so that would be school psychs. We had a few speech therapists, but we also had counseling department. So we just continued with the both the educational partners meeting as well as the leadership meeting of trying our best to provide educational partners with the information that we had received from leadership, and then likewise. And so we had about 4 root causes. And so I did want to emphasize, though, that the parents definitely acknowledged that they they felt that it was good to have their information placed within that document because they felt like that may not have always been a pattern.
So they were actually able to see where their input was inside of those root causes that were identified.
Yep.
Okay,
Sure
that's
were.
great.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. The next thing that you can do in step 2 is you can consider creating that target population, which is a group of focal students. You want to know which students you are focusing on when you're talking about disproportionality, and if you are providing interventions or activities that address disproportionality related to that group. It's really important that you narrow down that focus group. And this flow chart does have some specifics that are related to significant disproportionality around, the expectations and the law, but defining the criteria will help you narrow and then focus on a particular group of students experiencing those disproportionalities. And I mentioned in the initiative inventory how important that was to focus your services on the right students. And this is just another tool that can help you with that. And this is linked in the activity handout for the target population activity handout. And Dr. Woods, can you speak to us about the importance of that target population and defining it?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, we wanted to ensure that the impacted population, as required, was represented. Earlier, you did hear me speak about African American students and Hispanic students. And so we were able to broaden our target population by, again, looking at our qualitative data and our quantitative data, seeing our patterns there that were in relation to overrepresentation of certain student groups in discipline. And so that's one of the ways that we were able to ensure that we had the appropriate target population. The other thing we took a look at was criteria. And we had throughout both of these, I'll say when we were disproportionate and then when we were significantly disproportionate, we did have resources from SPP-TAP, but we also, of course, then had technical assistance. So in that technical assistance, we really leaned on that expertise to kind of get a handle on how do we, again, appropriately identify that target population and then implement services. So we chose to focus on school sites that had a higher number of African American students in their population. And then we looked at other criteria that could, impact this area of discipline. So that was chronic absenteeism, social and emotional areas, mental health, and academic performance. One thing that we did want to take a look at when we started to think about activities as well for the target population was what do we already have and what can be expanded and or what can we bring in. And so we were able to think about the culturally affirming student activities kind of in a different way during this process. And that was all because we were able to focus on, the impacted student population, which also became the primary target population.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pause again, just in case there are some questions before we move into step 3. And I'm not seeing any questions in chat, so I'm going to move on to step 3. Again, we're looking at the required activities that CDE requires for those LEAs who are disproportionate. And on the left-hand side, the plan for improvement should include at least one high leverage strategy to address disproportionality. And the consideration is pretty much thinking about the initiatives, staff, time, all of those resources that can contribute to addressing disproportionality that you already have in place. And that's, if you'll remember on the slide where I introduced Dr. Woods, there was really this alignment of the different initiatives. And I just wanted to check and see, Dr. Woods, is there anything else that you want to add around this alignment process or how it resulted in better outcomes for the students?
Yes. So I want to just emphasize intentionality. It's always going to feel like, okay, here's another thing we have to do. We could become, feeling like there's a lot of initiative fatigue, or we could feel like, haven't we already worked on this? Or we can just feel like, I'm not even sure where to start. But when you start to access the supports and the resources and think about all the things that you have done, where you're wanting to, what your goals are, your outcomes, I think when you're intentional about every aspect, that you'll be able to have a better focus for what the work looks like. For us in San Diego Unified, we still continue to work on the areas that we know still need improvement, and that would be implementation and sustainability. So throughout my experience on both the disproportionality and overrepresentation tasks and activities that were required from CDE and significant disproportionality, we've been able to come out of disproportionality in general. That is not something in I've been with San Diego Unified about 20 years. I've been a psych for I think over like 22 of those years. And so we feel good about the progress that we've made, and don't want to fall back, into those poor practices. But we still have a long way to go because we are falling under the risk ratio. We are still 2 times more likely to have students who African American students and our Latinx students experience higher rates of disciplinary actions. Likewise, with emotional disturbance, we are still 2 times more likely with African American students to see that they are the students referred and may qualify at a higher rate. We do have in our enrollment a smaller number of African American students that we know could, be playing a part in that risk ratio. But more importantly, there still is a lot of work to be done. So I don't want to ever give the impression, that we came out of SIGDIS or that we came out of disproportionality with just like flying colors. We fell below what is the risk ratio of 3.0. So Connie had mentioned earlier, there was that slide and it was 2.8, I think, on there. And she mentioned that's still work that needs to be done. So we acknowledge that, but we also acknowledge that we came out of previous years of having 5 times more likely in some of these areas. So we're still here doing the work. And we'll continue to be as intentional as possible. So that's what I would say about sticking to, getting started, or if you're already in it, being able to have this thought and idea about what this improvement can actually look like and how you measure that is important. Every success point counts.
I think what I'm hearing you say is that 3.0 is not a magic number. It does tip you over into that identification of disproportionality, but the numbers below that until you get to a 1.0 indicate that there's some kind of disparity going on. The other thing is that it is ongoing work. And so setting yourself up for a positive process that creates change that can be sustained over time is well worth the effort, because, you know, if you really truly want to move beyond just sliding below that 3.0, it's going to take time to make that happen. I'm going to take a pause now, and I'm going to encourage you, if you are writing a sim plan this year, and you are going to be completing steps 1 through 3, I'd like for you to just think about the different tools that we've talked about. And I want you to post in chat one of the tools that you're curious about, a tool you'd like more information about. And while you do that, I'm going to speak directly to those LEAs that are in step 4 of their sim. We know that those of you who are in step 4, that you are implementing a sim plan and you have some requirements. There are fewer requirements than those that are doing steps 1 through 3. There's the student record review, the data quality activity, and then the sim plan corrections, updates, and amendments. If your sim plan doesn't currently address disproportionality, you are expected to do these things, including that formal amendment. And so one of the things that you might want to consider is completing that student case study. This would really complement your student record review, and it would dig deeper into the student files so that you can examine what that student's journey is through the system to identification, placement, or disciplinary actions. And so it highlights that there are differences in experiences and where those gaps in the system are, or where the system may not be working as well as it could, or the way it should. And so those of you who are in step 4, that might be something that you would like to add to your list of things to consider. I have one more thing that Connie's going to share about another opportunity that you have.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Yeah, I think one of the things we want to make sure that everyone is aware of is that, again, when you're identified as significantly disproportionate, you're required to set aside that 15% of IDEA funds and develop these coordinated early intervening services. And it's called comprehensive because it's a requirement. But IDEA also allows for a voluntary movement of these funds. And I know that's not something that always makes sense for LEAs, but it's important for people to realize that it is an option. So if you are developing something within your SIM plan that's going to take some level of funding, LEAs can still move a portion up to 15%, no more than that, of their IDEA funds into a fund that is specific for early intervening services. Again, this is not, this LEAs often choose to do this on the other end. So like Tasha was describing, if your LEA is significantly disproportionate and they have things in place and they're successful, the last thing they want to do is just stop them all of a sudden because they fell below the 3.0 risk ratio. So while they're still working on it, they can still voluntarily keep some of the funds in that pot of money, be able to provide maybe some kind of blended funding so that they're not necessarily using all 15%, but a portion of that, and continue to provide services. That's one way of doing it, but again, it can happen proactively as well. So you could, again, obviously, this is a larger LEA decision, but we just want to make sure people are aware of it. If you do that, it is those funds are specifically for students in kindergarten through 12th grade with an emphasis on the early grades, right? Because it's early intervening, kindergarten through 3rd grade, which can be TK. And then there have to be for voluntary services. It needs to be students that are currently not identified as needing special education. So these would be general education students, and specifically using some kind of criteria. So what's the criteria for those students that need additional academic and or behavioral support to be successful in the general education environment? So it gets a little bit more complex, but again, if you need some support around this, would be happy to provide more guidance.
The type of activities that could happen with those funds are professional development, and this professional development for all staff, not just those that are supporting the students that you're trying to focus on in particular, that target group. And it can include educational and behavioral evaluations as long as they're not special education evaluations. And then again, different supports and services that are supportive, meaning supplemental, not supplanting things that are already happening. So that is, again, with the activities, it's most important that these are supplemental activities and that they're not supplanting funds that are made available, for other activities. One of the things just a reminder, if your LEA does choose to do something like this, it's very important that you include your SELPA in these conversations. SELPAs are the ones that report to CDE the LEAs that are using SACE funds, whether that's voluntary or required, and they're the ones that are really needing to keep those records straight with CDE. So it's important that SELPA is included in these conversations if it's something you're considering. And that's whether it's on the preventative side or on the after and sustaining side as well. Okay.
Connie, there's a question in chat. It says, what if 15% funds are already set aside before a district becomes SIGDIS? Do they have to set aside an additional 15%?
That's a really good question, Lisa. No, the max always is 15%. So if you are voluntary, it can be up to 15%. So let's just say this LEA did this preventively and decided they needed 10% of those funds. Once you're identified as significantly disproportionate, it is exactly 15%. So you can't do more than that. You can't do less than that. So in this LEA, as I said, if they preventively did 10%, then they were identified as significantly disproportionate. So they have to do this. It would the following year switch to 15%, but it would never go over that. Okay. Or again, once you're identified as significantly disproportionate, you couldn't just say, oh, we're going to continue with just the 10% and that's going to work. You couldn't do that. You'd have to be switched to exactly 15%. So thank you for asking that question. That's an important one. Okay. All right. And again, feel free to continue to pose questions. We do have just a few more minutes and we want to let you know about some of the additional supports that we have for you. We recognize that, again, this is not a one-time conversation. We don't want to take more of your time, but we do want to offer other opportunities for questions. When you really start digging into it, and as Susan said, we know some of you have to do an amendment of your SIM plan, or perhaps you're actually just beginning a SIM plan and need to make sure that you include a root cause and are addressing something tied to disproportionality. If you decide as you're working further in this that you could use some additional supports, just have a specific question, we're going to have office hours. You can see the date here on April 23rd from 12 to 1 p.m. These are, of course, voluntary, and you can just drop in. We'll have invitations that go out to folks, but just want to let you know in case you want to put that on your calendar. Of course, I'm going to share our contact information so you could reach out at any point, but just want to let you know that there are some things coming down the pike that can help you and you can set up on your calendar. In addition to that, for districts that are just this group right here, those that are disproportionate and not yet significantly disproportionate, we also want to do a community of practice meeting. And so we're going to have conversations where we're focusing on steps 2 to 4. So thinking more about what comes next. And we will be setting up at least one more, perhaps more than that, depending upon the need and what this group is asking for. So if you want more, we can schedule more. But we will also send that again as an invitation to you directly, those that have registered for this webinar. So we'll be looking on the lookout for that. It'll probably be June. Okay. And then again, we've gone at any point you want to add in chat questions, we have an evaluation, a quick poll that we want to ask you to fill out. It will just take a minute to find out again what else we can provide for you to make sure that you have the information you need to move forward. And then I do want to just switch the slide over so you can see our contact information. So we have a general email address for SPP-TAP. It's SPP-TAP at Napa, NAPACOE.org. And our website has been mentioned a couple times, but that is another really wonderful place to look for resources. You don't necessarily have to reach out to us, but you can definitely explore the website and find other things that will be helpful to you in this process. That's https://SPPTAP.org. Okay. And I'm going to thank once again Dr. Tasha Woods for joining us. Really, really appreciate your time and being so willing to describe your process very transparently, openly with the group. I think that's very helpful. And of course, our team here, thank you, Susan, Kian,